Hi, this is Stu Schulman with the story of building the grid. How I put a training grid made of astroturf into my front yard for my son to play soccer on. So, going back through the pictures and recreating this long history, I noticed that 2 days before this project started, we were down on Boyden Field. That's Coach Dan and I, filling holes and aerating and compressing a kind of soggy field. We'd had some hard weather over the winter and the field was in rough shape. So when we started the project on April 20th, 2015, the idea was to create a playing grid that was available as much of the year as possible. So I marked all the trees and hired Nick to come over with his chainsaw and his wood chipper, and we got going. And Nick brought down a lot of trees, about 35 trees, and sawed them up for me and hauled off the brush and hauled off the pines, left me with the hardwood. And by early May we were sort of picking up the pieces of Nick's work and starting to think about where the soccer field was going to go. My backhoe driver Billy was really quite an artist. He helped survey the property, and there was a slope going down toward the road, so we had to build a berm and clean out a spot to fill up with sand. As always, my good friend Colbert was ever present, trying to determine how all this activity was going to affect him. I think in the end he figures we built this for him. Almost 3 weeks into May, we had our berm with the big rocks in the corner and the dirt piled up on two edges, and Billy had scraped it out as best he could. I spent a fair bit of time going around just picking up the medium-sized rocks and hauling them over to the corner and throwing them in the pile. Kind of thought about that corner as a big drain for the whole thing, as the slope points right at it. Then we started bringing in the sand, and that was a lot of sand. I lost track how many dump trucks came. Billy told him where to put it, and then he spread it about. And when that phase was done, we were ready for a delivery of 96 pieces of 6 by 6 by 12 pressure treated wood, which is a lot of heavy wood. And we were able to get it dropped in on top of the sand, and by the end of May we were using helpers from FC Massachusetts Soccer Club, where we played and coached, Liam and I. And it was starting to warm up, so we get the sun tent out, but you can see the big stacks of wood, and in the background you can see a tool that I had rented on quite a few occasions, at one point for 2 solid weeks, which is a plate compactor, which helps smash things down into a nice flat surface. So more to say about that. For me, it got pretty exciting to see the corners form. We were a little wary about whether it would actually be the right shape in the end, and whether or not the rugs would sit right where they were supposed to. In the end they did, but we probably did this in a way that would horrify a professional. No doubt the kids were keen to play soccer, as was Bear. So by the end of May, we had soccer balls out, and Bear was actually popping a few of them. But we were able to play sand soccer as the early walls started forming around the edges of the grid. I used a lot of tools, bought a lot of tools for this project. It was a lot of winding and unwinding of the electrical cords. Occasionally I had to go on YouTube or ask a friend how to how to solve a problem like what happens when you bend a giant piece of rebar that's halfway in. We were using rebar. We drilled a lot of holes with the big wood drill, and then for the lower levels we knocked in 2-foot rebar to hold the walls in place. As it turns out, when those bend, it can be pretty hard to get the bent ones out, but if you take a pipe wrench and go counterclockwise with the pipe wrench, you gradually can get those out. We bent about 3 or 4, which I think was not bad considering how many of these things we drove in. We drove in a lot of those pieces of rebar. This is my friend Tim, who came on various occasions to help me out, which was great because more often than not I was working alone, and anytime I had help, whether it was from the soccer team, soccer parents, or Tim, it was great to have the help. I really needed it. This is just a little video from when we got some gravel. Saw that happen many times. Actually, the guy from the gravel company said I probably bought more gravel than just about anybody else who's ever been a residential customer. And you can see the gravel here. We left a spot open in the corner on the wall so the trucks could drive in. It's pretty hard to spread this half-inch trap rock. Nonetheless, I couldn't get my friend with the bobcat to come over, so I spent a fair bit of time shoveling and raking and pushing and pulling this gravel to try and get it spread out. I did get most of it spread out, but by the time my friend showed up with his bobcat and made it look like this, I wondered why I had spent so many days shoveling and raking gravel when it only took the bobcat a few minutes to spread things out nice and flat. Now the trick here was we were attempting to, and we succeeded, making one end higher and another end lower, so there's a difference of about 6 inches in height in the depth of the gravel, so that the uphill side is higher and the downhill side is lower. But that's quite a bit of gravel on top of about 2 feet of sand to ensure the drainage was going to happen. And this gravel was a piece of work, getting things on that proper slope, getting the final beams in place. Couldn't have done it with all the help, the great help, again, from the families and the players at FC Mass. And of course, when we had a barbecue, Bear was always there to make sure there was no wasting of food. This is what it looked from the opening where the truck would drive in. There's that plate compactor and the future site of what would be a greenhouse eventually off the back end. That's the back berm. And it was a big day, June 9th, when we closed the final corner and in fact figured out that we had created a shape that was conducive to laying down 3,600 square feet of astroturf. This was a big day, a big moment in the history of the project, because we were looking at this giant pile of foam and also these pallets full of green microfill, eco microfill, as the next big step. And we were very excited to get this stuff down because we knew that there was a delivery coming of the astroturf, and it was time to wrap up these steps, which meant hiring at times anybody I could get, including local movers, football players, and even a few guys from a local halfway house for people in recovery. So on the day that the turf arrived, we had 8 guys working, and they were great. They were big and strong, and when we unloaded the astroturf, there was 4 rolls. There were 4 rolls, 15 feet wide. Each one was 400 pounds, and it was piece of work to get them out onto the grid, and this is what it looked like once we got them out there. It was hard for 3 people to roll one of these rolls. Lifting it and moving it was quite another story. So gradually we got in what we thought was position to unroll the carpets and nail them down, sew them together, glue them together, nail them together. And I started feeling pretty cocky, like the worst was behind me, and I had managed this project over the hump. But as it turned out, you know, apart from having a very sore knee, I also determined that the half-inch trap rock that we had spread and leveled quite carefully was not flat enough. It didn't create a surface that was flat enough for what we wanted to do. So I had to bring in finer grained gravel, kind of gravel that you'd put on a driveway that has bits and pieces of crushed gravel in it and smaller pieces. And I had to spread that by hand from the edge in a wheelbarrow in these piles. And honestly, this was a rather discouraging moment in the project because I had to pick up all of the foam pads that we'd carefully laid out, order a whole bunch more rock, and then take load after load and dump it out at 3 or 4 piles per load, and then rake it out and still keep everything on the slope that we needed and have it level going across. This was not easy. This was, I think, a hard part for me to get through. I developed what I called a love-hate relationship with the gravel.
Starting to be a sort of love-hate relationship here with the gravel. Bear's not hauling any of it.
And my dog was no help at all for this part. He was there for moral support, though. So gradually the pads got relayed and all the finer gravel got put down, and the 400-pound carpets got rolled from one end to the other, and it seemed like the worst was behind me again, but it wasn't. So we're approaching the end of June, and again, lots of work with the plate compactor, smoothing out and leveling the finer gravel on top of the heavier gravel. And then once I got the pads down, I noticed a problem, and it caused me quite a bit of concern. We were into the hotter part of the summer, and during the hotter parts of the day, the pads would expand and they would bulk up like this. They would buckle, and quite dramatically in some places. And so I called the company that I bought the turf from, and they referred me to a so-called expert. And luckily I had Bear keeping me company through all this, because I would have gone crazy otherwise. And of course we still had more gravel coming in. But my so-called expert told me that I had to make a solid surface out of the pads, and this was bad advice. He recommended that I use construction glue, which was very messy and hard to use, and this landscape paper on top of the glue to try and make one solid surface that wouldn't buckle when the pads heated up. This was terrible, terrible advice. After about 3 or 4 rows of doing this, I abandoned the glue because it was so messy and hard to use, and it wasn't drying properly. In fact, later on, I discovered it never really dried properly. This is what it looked like putting it on. I can only say that I wish I had never seen this glue, and I wish I had never talked to the guy, who told me to put that glue in there. What he should have told me was that there needs to be about a half inch between every part of the grid of foam pads. In fact, probably a half inch to a full inch, because those things really do expand in the heat, and not having that spacing between the pads is a fatal error. Meanwhile, I had a nice moment where I tweeted a picture of the project in the state it was in, and got a favorite from one of our all-time favorite soccer players, Mix Discrude, on Twitter, who Liam got to meet after Landon Donovan's last international game. It was a great moment. Mix is a wonderful guy. He talked to Liam for a long time and listened to him and gave him a lot of advice. And I know that, as was the case with Landon and Coach Jurgen Klinsmann, meeting these gentlemen had a huge impact on Liam. Really inspirational. Anyway, back to the story. So we're getting these rugs out there, and moving one of these rugs, sort of inching it left or right or down or back, once it's spread out, is really hard. And there were a lot of times when I was alone and working on the project where I had to develop a method for moving these rugs a few inches. And I did develop it. It has to do with picking up a corner and lifting it up and down as fast as possible, shaking it the way you might shake a sheet out or something, and causing these ripples to go about halfway through the rug. And you can move the rug with these ripples, and then you go to the other end and ripple it from the other end. It's definitely an art. There's no way it's a science, but it can be done, and I did a lot of it. But it can be hard even when you have 3 or 4 football players to move one of those rugs. We did get the rugs lined up and prepared them for seaming them together, and in fact had a lot of success with the initial project of nailing them down, seaming them together. And at the end of a very long day when we did that, the kids were out playing and the rugs looked great. We had done it through the heat of the day when the rugs were expanded, and everything was shipshape and looking good, except the very next day I had to cut them open, pull out the nails, cut those seams that I had very carefully glued. And the reason was that because we didn't have the correct spacing, because the glue didn't work, for a variety of reasons, because we hadn't done a number of things correctly, in the hot part of the day, the foam pads expanded and the rug rippled in a way, it made a crisscrossing ripple all over the rugs. That was horrible. That made it unplayable, and that broke my heart. And when I realized that I had to cut open the rugs and roll them up and pull up all of the foam pads and relay them with proper spacing, I cried. I cried so hard. I cried a number of times that day. It was depressing. And one of the reasons was because we had already spread about 6,000 pounds of these little tiny green dots, the infill, and we had to get them back out, which was a nightmare. I did the first rug all by myself before I got the football players to come and help me with the rest. But I would pick up a corner and I'd pull it as far as I could, and all the green dots would make a pile, and I'd scoop them up with a shovel and wheelbarrow them out to the edge and dump them over onto this tarp. And when it got to the point that it was hard to scoop them, I would get the shop vac out and shop vac. And so we pulled all of the green dots out. We relayed all of the foam pads, which many of them were still dripping with wet glue that had never dried. So we had to take those out, wet glue, dry them in the sun. I mean, it was a huge step backwards. We had a thought we had finished the project, and in fact we had to go back and essentially redo some of the hardest steps, which we did. Because what are you going to do? Give up? No, not going to give up. One of the things I had to go in and do was put in a set of 2x4s around the base that I could nail and then wood screw the edges of the rugs into. I tried to use the big nails to hold it in place, and they don't hold it tight enough. So by putting this circuit of 2x4s embedded into the ground all the way around, I was able to pull and stretch the carpets tighter and to nail and screw them down in ways that made them much tighter. And ultimately, in the end, I had my pitch. Seams turned out pretty good despite my having had to cut them open after gluing them together. Far from ideal. But we had a pitch, we made a bench, a couple of benches, we had a barbecue and had kids over and set up the net, which was a lot of fun, eating and celebrating the grid with some of the boys, some of whom I'd coached for years and years and years in soccer. This was a great moment for us. Put in some corners, started to build a walkway around the edge, down the hill. I thought this all turned out super nice. Then I thought more benches, maybe some garden boxes. How about a cedar deck? Call it Coach's Corner. And on it went. So what am I working on now, you might wonder? Well, we got these aluminum tubes, and I finished my French drain here along where the hill comes down into the grid. And the old bear said, why not dig some big holes here, build a big shot blocking net. And that's exactly what I did. I went out and got the 24-inch auger, which is a tricky machine to use under any circumstances. Certainly running this right up next to the wall I had just built and the ground we had just dug was tricky, and I had to go 5 feet in, and I learned a lot about augers and how hard it is to make a hole in the ground, but ultimately I did make 4 holes, which involved dealing with big rocks and roots. Those rocks love to collect around the big roots. Get in there with the chainsaw sometimes, with the pickaxe, Collins axe. Again, Bear supervising the whole thing, and definitely excited for me to get that big root out of there because he chewed on it for a while after I got it out. But this was, a mini battle in the long war to get the job done, and I had my buddy there licking the sweat off my face. I also took on the growing of some grass, which involved putting in some sprinklers and taking a variety of methods of growing grass. This is what an almost finished hole looks like before it gets the sonotube, and this is what happens when your auger goes out of control while you're digging a deep hole. This is my Coach's Corner. I thought it turned out pretty good. That was my first railing I ever built. Turns out that the grid attracts a lot of frogs or toads or whatever this guy is. For a period there, I was pulling 2 or 3 out a day. They'd hop in and I'd have to catch them and put them on the other side of the wall. This is the sonotube. It had to be cut in 5-foot lengths. Actually, I got a couple of them. So I had 4 or 5-foot length sonotubes that I was loading into the holes by 3rd week of September. And this is what the boys were doing on the grid at that time. Pretty fun stuff. I bought a lot of tools for this job. If you're going to fill up 5 sonotubes with concrete, definitely need a concrete mixer. So I got one of those. It's a little tricky getting the mixer to the point where it would dump into the tubes. So I had to build a ramp to do that, and getting the bags up in there, that was tricky. It turns out it used about 110 bags. Those are 60, no, maybe 80-pound bags, 80-pound bags of concrete. So lifting those up and dumping those in and mixing them up and dumping them in the tubes or around the tubes to make a big bell on the outside, that was a big job. That went on for a while, and had to keep them covered when it rained. One day it rained super hard. I didn't have a couple of them covered. Then I had to get a bucket and a rope and bucket out all the water. That was not very fun. Meanwhile, that's what I'm talking about. Then my 23-foot poles arrived. These are like giant flag poles. And down at one end I had, the hill sloping away, so I had to build up an artificial hill to hold the top of the sonotubes. There's my concrete staging area. And heading into fall, we had grass growing out and the scene set to build the final hill that would lead up to the sonotubes. So Tim was there one day, or a couple of days, helping me with the moving of the gravel and the laying out of that landscape fabric. And then we brought a lot of loam in and built this watering station so the kids can reach it from inside the grid. And we built an artificial hill to hold the top of the sonotubes. This is our boys from FC Mass training on the grid with a little construction light into the fall. And this is October 24th. The hill is seeded, covered up with some landscaping fabric to help the grass germinate. The leaves are falling and it's all looking very, very nice. There is a bit of maintenance involved, getting that seam to sit down flat. I use these big long galvanized nails and my scissors to cut out extra strings. These are my aluminum poles. They look like giant flag poles. They're currently being painted in the basement. They will be nutmeg brown when they're done. And did my first planting on the grid, garlic of course, in the bench beds. If you're looking for the grid, it's just past the llamas up on this hill in Amherst, Massachusetts, North Amherst to be precise. It's a dog and soccer player friendly place, and it is completely, totally for my son Liam, who I love so much.